I'm about to become my own dad's father-in-law, and there's nothing I can do about it. How a simple double date turned my family into an unbelievable mess. I need to get this out because I feel like my life has turned into a twisted, inescapable joke. A week ago, I was in a normal, happy relationship. Now, I'm living in some kind of family paradox that defies logic. I'm 26M, and for the past year, I've been dating Julia, 44F. Yes, there's an age gap, but it's never been an issue. Julia is smart, beautiful, and emotionally mature in a way that makes every relationship I've had before feel like a waste of time. She's not some midlife crisis looking for a boy toy, and I'm not some lost young guy with mommy issues. We just get each other. Julia has a daughter, Ava, 22F, but we barely interact. She's got her own life, and since Julia and I don't live together, there was never much reason to cross paths. It wasn't some secret, just one of those things where schedules never aligned, and we never tried to force it. Everything was fine. And then my dad dropped a bombshell. David, 52M, my single father, announced that he had started seeing someone. He was over the moon, saying she was the most exciting woman he had met in years. I was genuinely happy for him. He's been alone since my mom left over a decade ago, and I always wanted him to find someone. Then came the dinner. It was supposed to be a double date. A fun night where I'd get to see my dad all giddy like a teenager, and he'd get to meet the woman who had been making me so happy. Julia and I arrived first, grabbed a table, and waited. When my dad finally walked in with his girlfriend, time stopped. Ava was by his side. Ava. Julia's daughter. The world tilted. Julia stiffened next to me, her hand tightening around her wine glass like she was about to snap the stem in half. Ava, who had clearly been just as in the dark as we were, went pale. Everything clicked at once. My dad was dating my girlfriend's daughter. If this continued, Julia, my girlfriend, would become my stepmother. Ava, my dad's girlfriend, would become my stepmother too. I would be my father's father-in-law. No one spoke for a full 10 seconds. The weight of the situation sank in like a heavy fog. My dad, still clueless, beamed at us and pulled out his chair like nothing was wrong. That was when I knew I was trapped in a nightmare. The weight of what was happening settled over the table like a physical force. No one spoke. No one moved. The whole restaurant faded into a dull hum of background noise as the four of us sat there, frozen in mutual horror. My dad, still oblivious, reached for his menu, completely unaware that he had just detonated a nuclear bomb in the middle of our lives. Across from me, Ava looked like she wanted to disappear into the floor. Julia, usually the most composed person in any room, sat rigid, her hand still clenched around her wine glass like it was the only thing keeping her tethered to reality. I felt my stomach twist itself into knots. Everything had changed in a matter of seconds. The relationship I had built with Julia now carried a ridiculous consequence I had never even imagined. The woman I had fallen in love with was about to become my stepmother. Ava, my dad's new girlfriend, would technically be my stepdaughter. The whole thing felt like a cruel joke the universe had decided to play on us. Julia was the first to move. She set her glass down carefully, like she was afraid any sudden movement would shatter the already delicate situation. Across the table, Ava barely lifted her head, still refusing to meet my eyes. There was no easy way to process this. No roadmap for how to navigate something this ridiculous. The longer we sat in silence, the more absurd it became. The logical part of my brain tried to work through the situation, but every outcome felt worse than the last. If both relationships continued, our family tree would become an inescapable paradox. If one of us ended things, it would mean tearing apart something that had made us happy, all because fate had decided to throw us into this impossible scenario. My dad, finally noticing the tension, looked around the table, confused. His excitement from earlier had faded slightly, but he still didn't seem to grasp the sheer weight of what had just happened. There was no avoiding it. No pretending this wasn't happening. The disaster had already unfolded, and now, we were left to pick up the pieces. And the worst part? None of us had any idea what to do next. The dinner continued, but no one was eating. The food arrived, placed carefully in front of us by a waiter who had no idea he was serving a table caught in a reality-warping nightmare. Forks remained untouched, drinks sat still, and the weight of what had just happened pressed down like a physical force. The realization sat between us like a ticking bomb. Julia had been my partner, my equal, someone I saw a future with. Now, through some ridiculous twist of fate, she was on the verge of becoming my stepmother. Ava, the woman my father had been doting on, would hold the same title. The mental gymnastics required to process it were exhausting. Ava hadn't spoken since the initial shock. She sat stiffly, her hands in her lap, avoiding eye contact with anyone at the table. It was hard to tell if she was embarrassed, horrified, or both. Julia remained composed in that way she always did, though the tension in her shoulders betrayed her internal struggle. My dad, however, had barely reacted. He still didn't seem to get it. The implications, the sheer absurdity of it all, hadn't settled into his brain yet. He acted as if this was just some minor coincidence, an amusing story we would all laugh about later. It wasn't. This wasn't a story to tell at family gatherings. This was an existential crisis wrapped in a family drama no one could have predicted. The thought of explaining this to extended family made my stomach turn. If my dad and Ava continued dating, there would come a point where introductions had to be made. How could I even begin to explain the new structure of our family without sounding like I was making it up? The longer we sat there, the clearer it became, someone had to put a stop to this. But who? And how? None of us wanted to break our own relationships, yet the alternative was a tangled mess of awkwardness that none of us were emotionally prepared for. The idea of seeing my dad and Ava at family events, holding hands, acting like a normal couple, while Julia and I stood there as another couple within the same twisted dynamic, made my head spin. There was no escaping it now. The disaster had already happened. The only question left was how much worse it was going to get. The dinner dragged on, but no one was really present. The food sat untouched, growing cold as the reality of the situation suffocated the table. Every second that passed made it clearer, this wasn't just an awkward coincidence. This was a disaster. A surreal, inescapable nightmare of tangled relationships and a family tree that now resembled a Mobius strip. Julia sat perfectly still, her expression locked in that careful neutrality she used when processing something too overwhelming to immediately react to. Ava remained frozen, looking down at her lap like she could will herself out of existence. The silence between us stretched, thick and unbearable, but the worst part was my dad. He still didn't get it. It wasn't just denial, it was something worse. A kind of blissful, willful ignorance, like he had already decided none of this was a big deal. He carried on sipping his drink, occasionally glancing around the table as if waiting for the tension to dissolve on its own. But it wouldn't. It couldn't. The reality was simple: if these relationships continued, Julia would become my stepmother. Ava would become my stepmother too. I would be my father's father-in-law. The sheer absurdity of it was enough to make my head pound. The thought of holidays made my stomach churn. I imagined Thanksgiving dinner, the four of us sitting at the table pretending nothing was wrong. I pictured future family events where I'd have to introduce Julia as both my girlfriend and my dad's wife, where Ava and I would have to pretend we weren't connected in a way that made no sense. There was no normal way to handle this. The only real question left was what happened next. Did Julia and I end things? Did Ava and my dad? Would someone finally acknowledge that this wasn't just some quirky little situation we could brush off? But the longer the silence stretched, the clearer it became: no one wanted to be the first to say it. No one wanted to be the villain who tore apart something that, until 10 minutes ago, had made them happy. And so, the four of us sat there, trapped in a moment that felt like it might never end, waiting for someone, anyone, to make the first move. The dinner ended in silence, and everyone left without addressing the elephant in the room. It wasn't a matter of needing time to think. No amount of thinking would make this situation make sense. But avoidance was easier than tackling the mess head-on, so that's exactly what happened. The car ride home with Julia was suffocating. Normally, there was a comfortable rhythm to our conversations, even in silence. But tonight, the air between us felt thick and unnatural, like we had been forcefully shoved into a reality neither of us knew how to escape. Her hand stayed in her lap, her jaw tight. She looked like she wanted to say something, but nothing came out. When she pulled into her driveway, she didn't immediately step out. I didn't either. The weight of what had happened was still settling, but avoidance could only last so long. She exhaled slowly, finally breaking the silence by saying she needed space to process everything. I could tell it wasn't an invitation for discussion, it was a warning. She got out of the car, walked inside, and closed the door without looking back. The pit in my stomach deepened as I drove home. I barely made it through the front door before my phone buzzed with a text from my dad. He was still riding the high of his new relationship, still completely oblivious to how deep into insanity we had all fallen. He wanted to grab a drink and laugh about tonight, like this was some sitcom plot we'd chuckle about in a few years. I turned my phone over, face down on the table, unable to even form a response. That was when I got the second text. It was from Ava. Unlike my dad, she had clearly realized the severity of this situation. Her message was short, just as simple, "Can we talk?" I hesitated before replying, but eventually agreed. Avoiding things wasn't going to fix this, and if there was anyone who truly understood how messed up this was, it was Ava. We met the next evening at a quiet cafe, the kind of place where no one paid attention to anyone else. She was already there when I arrived, sitting in a booth by the window, looking about as exhausted as I felt. For the first time since the disastrous dinner, I realized that as much as this situation was a nightmare for me, it was just as bad, if not worse, for her. Ava had spent her entire life with her mother. Now, suddenly, she was being asked to accept that her mom was dating me while she was dating my dad. Neither of us knew where to begin. She admitted that she and my dad had only been dating for a couple of months, and that it had started out casual. But my dad had fallen for her hard, and she wasn't sure what to do. She had tried to convince herself it wasn't a big deal, but sitting across from me now, she looked just as trapped in this mess as I was. She confessed something that made my stomach drop. She hadn't even told her mother yet that she was dating my dad. Julia had walked into that restaurant with no idea. I leaned back in my seat, running a hand over my face. That explained the shock on Julia's face at dinner. She hadn't just been blindsided, she had been completely unaware that this was even a possibility. Ava looked guilty. She hadn't planned to keep it a secret forever, but she also hadn't known how to bring it up. She had been worried about how her mom would react, and now she didn't even have to wonder. Everything had unraveled in real time. The conversation lingered on what came next, but no matter how many ways we looked at it, there was no good answer. If my dad and Ava stayed together, then Julia and I had to break up. If Julia and I stayed together, then my dad and Ava had to break up. And if we all stayed together, we would have to accept the kind of family dynamic that no one in their right mind would consider normal. It wasn't just about us, it was about the implications for the future. Holidays, family gatherings, relationships with extended family. It was impossible to ignore that our lives were now tangled in a way that no one could have anticipated. Ava admitted that she didn't see a long-term future with my dad, but she also didn't want to break things off just because of external pressure. My stomach twisted at her words because I felt the same way about Julia. I didn't want to end my relationship over this, but what other choice did I have? There was no easy way out of this, and the longer we sat in that cafe, the more it became clear, we had both walked into something we were never going to escape from unscathed. Meeting with Ava didn't provide any solutions, only more questions, more complications, more reminders that this situation was a slow-motion disaster. Neither of us wanted to be the first to say it, but the truth hung between us, something had to give. Leaving the cafe, I felt even more exhausted than before. The moment I got home, I collapsed onto my couch, staring at the ceiling while my mind spiraled. Everything had changed so fast. Just days ago, my relationship with Julia had been solid, uncomplicated, something that finally felt like it made sense. Now, it was all tainted by the ridiculous reality of what had happened. I hadn't spoken to Julia since the dinner. She had asked for space, and I respected that. But avoiding each other forever wasn't an option. The next morning, I woke up to another text from my dad. He wanted to grab lunch. Just me and him. There was no getting out of it, and honestly, I needed to know what the hell he was thinking. We met at a small bar near his office, the kind of place he liked to take me when he wanted to talk about man-to-man things. Except this time, the situation wasn't something a casual beer could fix. Dad, as expected, was still oblivious. He greeted me with a grin, clapped me on the shoulder, and launched into how funny and unexpected the whole situation was. He kept brushing it off, calling it a wild coincidence rather than the complete family dynamic apocalypse that it actually was. It became clear within minutes that he saw no problem with moving forward. He was happy. He liked Ava. He didn't see why some technicalities should stop them from being together. Technicalities. He actually used that word. I gritted my teeth as I listened to him ramble about how life throws surprises at you, how love isn't always predictable, how we just needed to be open-minded. He spoke as if this was just an odd quirk in our lives, not a full-blown existential crisis that turned our family tree into a pretzel. For the first time, real anger bubbled up. It wasn't just the situation itself, it was the ease with which he dismissed the impact it had on the rest of us. He didn't care how this affected me, how this forced Julia and me into a situation where we had to make a choice that should have never been forced on us. I tried to explain, to break it down for him, to get him to see past his honeymoon phase delusion, but every time I pushed back, he waved it off. He saw no reason to stop dating Ava, and he made it clear that if I had a problem with it, it was my problem to deal with. The conversation left me with a sick feeling in my stomach. This wasn't just some weird situation we had to laugh through. This was my dad outright choosing to make things harder for everyone else because he didn't want to give up his fun. Leaving the bar, I realized something I hadn't fully accepted before. Dad wasn't going to back down. If something was going to change, it had to come from me or Julia. The thought made my chest feel heavy. I had spent the last year falling for Julia, believing that I had finally found something stable, something real. Now, I had to ask myself the impossible question, was I willing to give it up to keep my family from spiraling into chaos? Meeting Julia again felt like standing at the edge of something inevitable. Neither of us wanted to be the first to say it, but the weight of reality had already made the decision for us. For days, we had both tried to imagine a future where this worked. A future where we ignored the absurdity of our parents' choices, where we smiled through family gatherings and pretended it wasn't insane that she would be both my ex and my stepmother. No matter how we looked at it, the future was unbearable. She had spent years raising Ava, building a life for her. Now, she was supposed to act like it was normal for her daughter to be dating my dad. Just as I was expected to accept that my father's girlfriend was now my stepdaughter. Love wasn't the problem. The problem was that love alone couldn't fix something this broken. Julia sighed, rubbing her temples before looking at me. There was no anger, no bitterness, just exhaustion. We had been forced into something neither of us had asked for, and now we had no choice but to let go. She reached for my hand, squeezing it once, briefly, before pulling away. And just like that, we both knew. It was over. The breakup never happened. After days of thinking, of trying to justify tearing everything apart, I came to the only real conclusion: this was life now. Julia and I weren't ending things. My dad and Ava weren't either. No amount of overthinking or discomfort would change what had already happened. I could either fight a battle I was never going to win or accept that the world had simply decided to rearrange itself in the weirdest way possible. So, I accepted it. The relationships stayed exactly as they were, and slowly, the shock faded. At first, every interaction with Ava felt stiff, like we were walking around a broken piece of reality, pretending not to notice the cracks. But with time, the awkwardness dulled into something manageable. Julia and I stayed together. It wasn't perfect, but neither of us wanted to lose what we had over some technicality we couldn't control. My dad and Ava continued their relationship too, completely unfazed by the chaos they had created. They were happy, and that was enough for them. The world didn't stop just because our family structure no longer made sense. We all still had jobs, still had responsibilities, still had lives to live. And weirdly enough, we did. Family gatherings became an exercise in ignoring the obvious, but people adjusted. The first time we all sat down for dinner together again, I braced for the unbearable tension that never came. Things had changed, but somehow, we all found a way to exist in it. It wasn't normal, but what was normal anyway? At some point, life just keeps moving forward. And that's exactly what we did. Time has a way of making even the strangest things feel ordinary. What once felt like an inescapable nightmare slowly faded into something I could live with. Life didn't wait for us to process the weirdness, it just kept going. At first, every interaction carried the weight of the absurdity. Seeing my dad and Ava together felt like watching a glitch in reality, like something I wasn't meant to witness. I avoided it when I could, but that only made things worse. The only way to get through it was to face it. Julia and I settled into our routine, and so did my dad and Ava. Our relationships didn't fall apart. No dramatic breakups. No family-wide intervention. Just two couples figuring out how to exist in a dynamic that shouldn't have existed at all. And somehow, we did. The first few family gatherings were painfully awkward. I could feel every relative resisting the urge to say something, their eyes darting between Julia, Ava, my dad, and me like they were trying to piece together a puzzle that refused to make sense. But people get tired of reacting. Eventually, they stopped whispering. They stopped analyzing. The novelty wore off. Holidays became just holidays again. The first Thanksgiving was rough, Ava and I barely spoke, Julia looked exhausted, and my dad kept grinning like everything was normal. But by the next Christmas, things had already shifted. We all went through the motions, presents, dinner, the usual conversations. No one tiptoed around the situation anymore. No one acted like we were cursed by some cosmic joke. Even Ava and I learned how to coexist. We didn't become close, but we found a way to exist in the same space without it feeling unbearable. There were occasional weird moments, like when she jokingly called me "old man" in front of my dad and then realized what she had just implied, but those moments became rare. We both accepted that neither of us had chosen this, and there was no point in making it harder than it needed to be. The strangest part was how completely unfazed my dad and Ava were. From day one, they acted like nothing about this was a problem. They never had a moment of doubt, never considered ending things for the sake of appearances. They were just happy. And at some point, I realized that was what mattered. I stopped worrying about what people thought. The judgment, the disbelief, the raised eyebrows, they didn't change anything. Julia and I were happy. My dad and Ava were happy. There was no unwritten rule saying we had to destroy our relationships just because they made other people uncomfortable. What once felt impossible became just life. It wasn't a crisis anymore. It wasn't a problem to be solved. It was just how things were. A year passed. Then another. And just like that, the thing that once felt like an unbelievable, absurd disaster became nothing more than life. Julia and I stayed together. My dad and Ava did too. No one caved. No one gave up. The universe had thrown us into an impossible situation, and instead of fighting it, we had all just moved forward. At some point, the shock wore off completely. The weirdness faded into something manageable, something that didn't take up space in my head anymore. When I introduced Julia to new people, I didn't feel the need to explain the situation. She was just my girlfriend. When I saw my dad and Ava together, I didn't overthink it. They were just a couple. The world didn't explode. Life didn't stop. Family gatherings became just family gatherings. The first year had been full of side glances and awkward pauses, but after a while, no one bothered bringing it up anymore. People adjusted. The conversation stopped feeling forced. The tension disappeared. We were just two couples who happened to be tangled in the weirdest way possible, but at the end of the day, that was our business, and no one else's. Even Ava and I figured out how to exist around each other without feeling like we were trapped in some surreal joke. We didn't suddenly become best friends, but we got used to it. We accepted it because there was nothing else to do. And my dad? He never changed. He never doubted his decision, never apologized for how bizarre it all was. In his mind, he had found someone he cared about, and that was all that mattered. Maybe he was right. Maybe he had always been right. At some point, I realized I had stopped caring about the labels. Step this, step that, father-in-law paradox, family tree pretzel, it didn't matter. We weren't breaking any laws. We weren't hurting anyone. It was just life. It wasn't normal. But what is?